want to have a look at what's going on in the world around us. Next slide, please. The South African economy is a small, open economy. And a small open economy means that whatever is going on internationally will affect the South African economy as well. So a couple of things that I will be looking at very quickly: the war, the Ukrainian war, the Russian economy, which actually surprised. Taiwan is still another political flashpoint that we are waiting. Yeah, we're waiting for that one to explode. India, some interesting stuff happening there. China, also some interesting stuff. Scotland could leave the Union. That means a lot of trouble for the British economy. Latin America swings to the left. That is important for things like, for example, the oil price. I'll get to that just now. Inflation internationally seems to be slowing down a little bit, and I think the US economy is just absolutely a miracle. Next slide, please. So the US economy is doing absolutely amazing, and I'll touch a little bit on the US economy. All right, so 1 year now since the war in Ukraine, what Putin achieved is that he's created a country, basically. Before that, I don't think there was the real Ukrainian national feeling, but now all of a sudden, all Ukrainians are very proud Ukrainians. So that is an unintended consequence of Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Clearly, the United States and the European Union is supporting Ukraine. There's a possibility of this war escalating, although the most likely scenario is for a long, protracted war that can go on for many, many years. But things can really get ugly, including the possibility of a nuclear conflict, and then we will be talking of a world war. The Russian economy is really surprising, me at least, because they are in an economy in a recession, but quite a mild recession. Of course, the impact on the Ukrainian economy is significant, something like -50, -60% contraction. The winter in Europe was quite mild, so the impact of the shortage of energy in Europe is having much less of an effect than what people thought previously. And recently, what I'm a bit concerned about, it seems as if China can start supplying the Russians with weapons as well, and that can lead to an escalation of the conflict. Next slide, please. For the rest of the world, a few other things that is going on that I think is worth mentioning. Taiwan is still an outstanding political issue, which can also lead to a military conflict, for example, in the East. India is a very interesting economy. The Indian economy, what is happening there, the Indian population will this year, for the first time in history, be bigger than the Chinese population. So the Indian economy, or India, will be the country with its biggest population in the world. And I think India is going to be the next growth engine of the global economy. That economy is going to take over from China. The Chinese economy is still growing this year, probably around about 5% or so, but economic growth is certainly slowing down to more normal levels of economic growth. And something else that is happening in China is that the population, the first time since 1960, since the Great Leap Forward, that the Chinese population is actually in decline. And see what happened to the Japanese economy when the population starts falling. And something else to keep an eye on, next slide please, is the Japanese so-called yield curve control. They've got a new central banker there, and that central banker, at the moment, what they do, the central bank in Japan says that long bond yields will be kept at zero, and they can't keep on doing that forever. And I think, now go down, please. Oh, that one is fine. Long bond yields, yeah. So long bond yields from now on will be allowed to go up. And since we're talking about a significant a major player in the world capital market, it can potentially be quite disruptive to the world's capital market. So keep an eye on that one. I'm a little bit concerned about that. If there are questions, I'll try to answer on that. Scotland is likely to leave the Union if there's a referendum. Of course, the Brits don't want to allow for a referendum there. They have a new first minister in Scotland. And if Scotland leaves the Union, then the British economy will dip into a deeper recession. The British economy is very deep in trouble. Latin America swinging to the left. With that, of course, the election of Lula in Brazil, and Lula is quite friendly with Maduro in Venezuela, and that means that Venezuela, the sanctions against Venezuela might be lifted, and that means that they will start pumping more oil, and that's part of the reason why the oil price is slowly drifting lower. International inflation slowly lower. I think the worst is behind us. It's the same for interest rates. I think next slide, please. Interest rates internationally, we're probably going to see a little bit more of an increase in interest rates internationally, but not much. I think the worst is probably behind us. And then the US economy is really surprising everybody. They will keep on increasing interest rates in the US until one of two things break. Either unemployment goes up or inflation goes down sharply. So expect further increases in interest rates US, and that in itself, of course, can have certain implications for the South African and in the rest of the world. This specific slide is just an estimate, World Bank estimates on economic growth globally. I disagree with one or two here, but if you download the presentation, you can get all these estimates on global economic growth in certain regions in the world as well. Next slide, please. So I don't necessarily agree with all of this. This is an important slide. This is just commodity prices internationally, some selected commodity prices. The oil price has been drifting lower for reasons that I've mentioned, and I think that the oil price is likely to continue its downward trajectory. I think the oil price will probably stabilize at around $70-$75 or so, except if we see some escalation of the war in the Ukraine, then of course this can have the opposite impact. But the most likely scenario is for the oil price to keep on going lower, which will be very good for South Africa, which means that the inflation in South Africa is also likely to start falling even further. Palladium price, South Africa is a major exporter of palladium and of course coal, and that is a bit of bad news for South Africa because the Minister of Finance has been collecting a lot of taxes on these exports, and with palladium prices or well, commodity prices coming down, with the exception of oil of course, but when other commodity prices start coming down, then it will be bad for this windfall tax by the Minister of Finance, and I don't think it will be repeated next year again. Keep that in mind because I'm going to get back to this a little bit later. Next slide, please. All right, what's cooking in South Africa? Next slide, please. Of course, as always, you have to see what's going on with politics in the country, and let's start off with politics and a few things that the president has said. The president is a politician after all, and I must tell you a few things that the president commented on recently is really creating more trouble than anything else. Let me give you some examples. We need to fix electricity, as we all know in South Africa. The president recently said that some debts, like, for example, the debt of Soweto needs to be written off. Now, that's an irresponsible thing to say because Eskom needs the income somewhere. So where's the money going to come from? And if you write off the debt of Soweto, what now? Are they going to start paying in future? I really doubt that. And for a president to say something like this, it's pure populism. The president also mentioned that Eskom should not consider this increase in electricity prices granted by NERSA. And again, that's an irresponsible thing to say. But where's the money going to come from then? So why do we have NERSA? That kind of questions. We have a state of disaster in South Africa. Well, certainly there's a crisis in South Africa because of electricity. I don't think the state of disaster was the right approach. I would have preferred something like business rescue. We don't have a new cabinet yet. Well, not the last time I've looked at least. And I am listening to the State of the Nation of the president is that I'm really having difficulty believing him simply because I who his team is that's going to implement all these promises that the president has been making. Now we have the Minister of Electricity, or supposed to get one, but we also have a Minister of State-owned Enterprises and a Minister of Energy, and we have the Deputy President responsible for electricity, and we have got a committee responsible for electricity. There are just too many cooks in this kitchen, I'm afraid to say. If everybody is responsible for this, nobody's going to be responsible for this. But the good thing is, certainly, when you talk about electricity, what is actually happening now, listen to this, we are in the process of privatizing Eskom. That process has already started. I'll get back to that a little bit later. Next slide, please. The minister made some announcements on Eskom. Of course, you can't use the word privatization. It's a swear word in the ANC. It's the same old ANC, so they still remain committed to cadres. See how the ANC reacted to what the writer has said the last 2 days or whatever. Now, that is really, he's dropped a bombshell there. They still committed to their short-term political objectives, which again is causing a lot of damage to the economy, little progress on the real prosecutions, and the implementation of the Zondo recommendations. But I must say, the Minister of Finance did make more money available for the for the implementation of the recommendations of the Zondo Commission. We're waiting for the new cabinet, but for the rest, it's business as usual. Do not expect significant changes. There's an election around the corner. Expect that the continuation of the collapse of infrastructure, crime, corruption, and a lack of service delivery and everything that goes with that. Next slide, please. So it's the same old ANC. I don't think we're going to see significant changes. In the meantime, people are getting restless. We are entering a new era for politics in South Africa. Chances are quite good that the ANC will get below 50%. There are three possible scenarios. The most likely scenario is the second one there, the ANC going into coalition with some of the smaller political parties. That's assuming the ANC gets 45 or a little bit more. Then a coalition between the ANC and the other smaller political parties is the most likely scenario. Followed by the second possible scenario, the ANC, that's if they get below 45%, ANC and EFF. And then the third scenario, which is very unlikely, and it's for the opposition parties to come together in an opposition, in a coalition. That's unlikely to happen. The important point is that we're reaching the end of the ANC. This is the beginning of the end of the ANC, which is a good. They've done immense damage to South Africa. Next slide, please. The big question, of course, is what's going to happen in the elections. Just a few other things. Unemployment, as we know, very, very high. Poverty levels very high, and absolute poverty levels are increasing as well. And we are seeing more and more protests in South Africa. Next slide, please. Talking about the unemployment, this is just a trajectory of unemployment in South Africa. And I'm afraid economic growth where it is at the moment. In fact, I'm actually more negative on economic growth than the Minister of Finance. So I'm afraid this is likely to keep on going up. Next, please. The other slide, the next slide is about protests, and you can go to the next slide as well. So this is, again, I will give you the QR code, and you can download it and have a look at that. I just want to point out this specific graph. This is where the protests are happening in South Africa. You can clearly see in KZN, that's where a lot of protests are happening. The other one is in Gauteng area, and the third sort of concentration of protests is in the northern part of South Africa. So expect, if there's public violence or something like that, or what we saw 2 years ago in KZN, expect it to happen more or less in those kind of areas. Next slide, please. All right. Now, if you want to vote for me, and if I have to compile macroeconomic policies, look at the left-hand column there. This is my macroeconomic policies. So this is what I think if you decide who to vote for, look for what's standing on that benchmark, in that benchmark column over there. This is what I would have put in my macroeconomic policies if I was a political party. Protection of private property rights, that must be number one. It must be always number one. The second one, free trade, because free trade is the only real free lunch. And a free lunch means that if two individuals are trading with one another, both the buyer and the seller gain from this transaction. Otherwise, the transaction would not have happened. And there's no free lunch except for that one. So the more you allow for free trade, the more free lunches you create. Privatization, of course, I will do that. Law and order, that's crucially important. That's the primary function of the state. Prioritize primary education. Primary education in South Africa is absolutely horrible if you compare it to the rest of the world. There's some information on TIMS and Pearl studies as an example. Professionalize the civil service. Forget about cadre deployment and all these other social objectives. Selected infrastructural development. What I mean by that is that certain things that what economists call collective goods should be the responsibility of the state. That's, for example, highways and these high pylons by Eskom, but for the rest, leave it to the private sector. The fiscal accounts needs to be stabilized. I'll get to that just now. Fix Eskom, basically. And fix Eskom means that you have to restructure Eskom, which means you have to fire a lot of people. We have to understand, if we don't take these decisions, we're not going to fix Eskom. We have to fire a lot of people. There are too many people, certain categories of people at Eskom. Politically, that's impossible to do. We have to force the municipalities to pay their outstanding debt. And again, that's politically very difficult to do. We have to get private sector participation, sell off some of the assets, take over all of the debt of Eskom, not only portion like what is done. Then we're going to fix electricity in South Africa. And in a way, that is exactly what is happening. The Minister of Finance announced that private sector, that all these power stations need to be concessioned out. So the operations of Eskom is being concessioned out, and a couple of other announcements that is made before he is prepared to take over the debt of Eskom. So what is happening here is that we are through the back door busy privatizing Eskom, the way that we have privatized, in a way, the airways in South Africa. South African Airways came to an end. It died, simply died. The post office is currently dying, and Eskom is also dying, and the private sector is going to take over this. And I also would like to see lower inflation targets and a point target, and the abolition of all, next slide, and no foreign exchange regulations. That's what I would. So if you want to go and vote for somebody, look for those points, those specific points. This is just a slide on some of the most recent economic data points, which we all know. Next slide, please. And the next slide shows us what the Minister of Finance. So this is a slide of the Minister of Finance. Now, this is one of the major risks in the budget. Go to that one, gross domestic product. That's the minister's estimates for economic growth. Just keep in mind that the Reserve Bank expects for 2023 economic growth. Just one back, please. The Reserve Bank expects the economic growth for 2023 at 0.3%. The Minister of Finance reckons it's 0.9%. We just went into stage 7 load shedding. So I don't think we're going to see zero. In fact, if you look at the leading indicator of the South African Reserve Bank, it's a good possibility that the economy is already in a recession. And that means that the Minister of Finance's revenue can potentially come in lower than expected, especially with a falling commodity cycle at the moment. So that is a major risk to the budget, and that is revenue simply will not materialize. The same goes for subsequent years, 24 and 25 as well. Next slide, please. So one of the major risks to this budget is that I think the Minister of Finance is too optimistic in terms of economic growth. This is just a slide. The red line there is the world's per capita GDP, which I've flattened out, and I've measured South Africa relative to the world's per capita GDP. And there you can see, in 1994, South Africa's per capita GDP was equal to about 85% of that of the world, and today that is closer to about 60% relative to the rest of the world. We've really lost out dramatically the past 30 years relative in terms of per capita GDP. But look at the middle years. There was some time for economic growth. There was some economic growth in the middle years, but I'm afraid recently that downward trajectory has been re-established again. And this year it will fall further, and probably next year as well. The world economy, next slide, please. The world economy is growing around about 3%. The South African economy is growing basically at 0. In 1994, this is a moving average. So, in fact, in 1994, South Africa generated on a per capita basis more electricity than the rest of the world. And there the graph says it all. So on a per capita basis, compared to the rest of the world, we are generating less and less and less. Next slide, please. Now, the next slide is a very interesting one. This is my own calculation. Now, I'm not going to get into the nuts and bolts of this, but suffice to say the following. In 2007, if you used 100 units of electricity in 2007, and you produced 100 units of GDP, of economic growth, then of you will use 100 to produce 100 GDP. That is that this slide basically means in 2007. In 2022, today, we produce 130 units of GDP by still using 100 units of Eskom's electricity. So two things are happening here. The one is that we're using electricity much more efficiently in South Africa. That's the first point. And secondly, we are generating our own electricity more and more. And that means, and that's part of the reason why I say that Eskom is slowly dying, and it's going to come to an end, and the private sector is going to take this over as well. So there's a bit of a silver lining here. And the silver lining is that our electricity efficiency, or let's call it electricity productivity, has gone up quite nicely. So that at least is a bit of a silver lining. Next slide, please. And the additional silver lining is then of course, as the state-owned enterprises are collapsing, that creates a lot of opportunities for the private sector to participate in the economy. The current account deficit, I mentioned that already. The current account deficit is already dipped into a negative. Many reasons for that. Very importantly, commodity cycle coming to an end, it seems, or cooling down at least. But this also suggests that the rand can potentially come under pressure if the current account remains in a deficit. We are in need of international capital counter this. Next slide, please. So that's part of the reason why I'm a little bit concerned about the exchange rate of the currency. Interest rates, this is just repo rate and inflation. I think inflation, the worst is over, although we can see a bit of a hiccup on inflation in the short term because of rising petrol price. The petrol price is going to go up again next month. But overall, I think that the trend for inflation is lower. I think the Reserve Bank might increase interest rates a little bit more, but the worst is probably behind us. I think another 25 bips, and then it's done. And by the second half of this year, next slide, please. By the second half of this year, chances are quite good that we can see interest rates coming down again. This is just GDP. Our forecast for GDP last year, I think about 2.5%. This year, 0. And you pick a number for subsequent years. I just don't know. It really depends on what's going to happen to electricity in the country. Next slide, please. So this is the biggest threat to the budget in itself. The money is finished and clear, you guys. Let's have a look at the budget itself, please. Next slide. A few things in the budget. The tax burden, we've got a rising tax burden. There was an unexpected tax windfall because of strong commodities cycle still last year, but that is coming to an end. Economic growth is weak, which means that the minister's collections on taxes are likely to come under pressure over the next couple of years. There's huge social demand on more spending. This budget is a pro-poor budget. All budgets are always pro-poor. 60% of total spending is on social expenditures. And don't tell me this is not a pro-poor budget. It is, it always is a pro-poor budget. The state is a massive dis-saver. State-owned enterprises are collapsing. Not all of them. Safcol, by the way, they're doing actually quite well, but the majority of state-owned enterprises are collapsing. And I'm very concerned about debt trajectory. Keep in mind, so weak economic growth means less tax collections, but it also means a smaller economy. That means the ratio debt and deficit relative to GDP is also coming to come under pressure. Next slide, please. So the debt trajectory is something that the rating agency certainly will be concerned about. The top line is state spending. The dotted line is the minister's forecast after that. And as always, politicians will always tell us, this year it's maybe we're not going to spend less, but next year we are. They always tell you that. So that's what he says as well. So this year we're going to spend a little bit more relative to the economy, but next year we will spend less. The same with the revenue. This year we're going to get a little bit less, but next year we're going to get in. And the gap between those two is the fiscal deficit, of course. But the problem is, I mentioned earlier, the tax burden has been increasing, and the tax burden has been increasing simply because politicians are spending too much money. Next slide, please. The next slide is just the Minister of Finance's slide. I just want to point out the budget balance as a percentage of GDP. The Minister of Finance got that at 4.2%. Just something that is important, which is a good news story. We have a fiscal fiscal surplus, a primary surplus today, which means if you ignore interest payments, then if we have got a fiscal surplus, which means that the Minister of Finance is actually quite good in keeping a lid on discretionary spending. The only reason why we have a fiscal deficit as large as it is because of huge amount of money that we need to spend on interest. So, but if you take interest out of the equation, then we're running actually a surplus, which means that the Minister of Finance is keeping, or at least being quite successful in keeping a lid on discretionary spending. So the other expense items. But yet, I don't think I agree with him in the years going forward. I think the fiscal deficit, because of a weaker economy, is likely to be bigger than what he's predicting there. Next slide, please. Let me see, look at the time. Okay, these are all the major expense items. Look at the right hand, the column on the right, and go down a little bit. You will see there's an 8.9% increase, and that's for debt servicing costs. You can have a look later on for the rest if you want to. But in most cases, spending is actually falling in real terms. So it's increasing at a rate below inflation. with the one exception, and that's debt service costs. That's interest on state debt. And interest on state debt is going up because the debt levels are going up as well. And I've got some slides on that. The next one, please. I've got some slide on that as well. This is the total debt as a percentage of GDP. And as you can see, it's been rising forever. And this is something that we need quite very much concerned about. This is crucial to get this down. Next one, please. Okay, where's the money coming from? The bulk of the money comes from that blue one there. That's personal income taxes, followed by this orangey one, and that's value-added tax, and then corporate income taxes. And the fourth most important revenue source to the Minister of Finance is that blue, the other blue one, and that is value-added tax. The Minister of, rather, it's not value-added tax, it's a fuel levy. The Minister of Finance did not increase any of these taxes. He made some adjustments. Jackie went through those. He did make some adjustments. Basically, no changes in real terms to the various taxes. But this is where the taxes come from. Look on top there. There's a minus 4%, and that's the customs union. That's how much we pay over to our custom union countries, and that is about 80 billion. Next slide, please. And I've got some interesting slides on that one. Here it is. Now, this is old data, 2020, 2021, and this is how much we contribute via the customs union budgets of the various countries. In the case of Namibia, we contribute 37% to their budget. Lesotho 50%, Swaziland about 60%, or Eswatini. That's going to go up, by the way, this year. Botswana about 27%. In South Africa, of our total income is about 7%. On a per capita basis, that gives you a better idea on who really benefits from the customs union. In Namibians, they get on a per capita basis about 9,000 rand. Lesotho about 4,000. Swaziland close to 10,000 and 9,000 for Botswana, and South Africa gets less than 1,000. So basically what happens is that South Africa, next slide please, South Africa is subsidizing our neighbors in terms of the customs union, if you look at the customs union payments. I'm not going to go through all of this. I just want to point out 1% of all personal income taxpayers, that is on the left-hand side, that top little thin blue line, that represent 163,000 individual taxpayers. So 163,000 individual taxpayers pay nearly a third of total personal income taxes. This is why I say we've got a very, very narrow tax base. And the rest of the numbers, it speaks for itself. Next one, please. Look at corporate income taxes. Less than 0.09% of companies, that is less than 1,000 companies, 770 companies in a country, pays 2/3 of all company taxes. Let that sink in for a moment. We don't have company taxes. That's the point I'm making. A few companies pay the taxes, the rest don't, basically. That's what it comes down to. Next one, please. So, so that's why the Minister of Finance didn't increase taxes. He's so dependent on very few taxpayers that you simply cannot increase taxes. And overall, the tax is about 100 billion because of the commodity cycle. The relief on the solar panels and some other tax relief for energy tax incentives and so on, that is neither here or there. We're talking really small change. It's just less than 15 billion in total. I don't like it if the minister uses a tax system to get people to do stuff or not to do stuff. Theoretically, that's wrong. So I'm against these kind of things. And then anyway, the amounts of money are relatively small. Next one, please. No, on the fuel levy, that was a bit of a surprise. I thought he's going to increase that. All taxes are always bad, but the fuel levy is one of the least bad taxes. Yeah, next one, please. That was a bit of a surprise. I thought he's going to go for that. Where's the money going to? Education gets the bulk of the money. Social protection, number 2. Number 3 is that grey one, interest on state debt. And then health services is that, what's it, yellowish kind of color. In total, social expenditure is approximately 60% to GDP. So interest is the third most important one. Next one, please. Look at interest here. That's the red one, as percentage of total state expenditure. The blue one is the grants, basically. And in next year, the social grant will come to an end. And when that comes to an end, interest will become the second most important expense item of the Minister of Finance. But take my word for it, this social grant or this COVID grant will be extended again. They always do that. There's nothing as permanent as a temporary state expense item. Next one. What else is here that's important? So interest will become nearly 20% of total state expenditure. 20% of total state expenditure goes to interest. This is becoming a real problem. But South African Airways, another billion. I mean, the post office is dying as well. Another threat to the budget. And Minister of Finance, he budgeting for a 3.3% increase in the wage bill. I don't think that's going to happen. There's an election next year. The civil servants are threatening they are threatening to go to the streets and cause havoc. And of course, USATU is important to the tripartite alliance. So I can't see how the Minister of Finance is going to get away with 3.3%. But anyway, that's what he's budgeting for. And that's a second potential threat to the budget. And that is that he won't be able to keep a lid on the wage bill. Next slide, please. So the wage bill and low economic growth are the two important ones. All right. So this is just the red line are the number of people receiving grants in South Africa. The blue line are the number of people that got jobs in South Africa. The green line is the ratio between the two. You can see the red line is supposed to come down sharply next year. And again, that's not going to happen because the minister cannot, once you start giving people money, you can't take it away. So the grants will continue. But I assume that the minister will be successful in paying the grants. But the point I want to make here is that for every one person working in South Africa, there are two people receiving a grant. Let that sink in for a moment. For every one person with a job, two people receive grants directly from the state. Every month, approximately 30 million people receive an income from the state. Remember, there are about 2 million civil servants as well. Next slide, please. Now, this is just unsustainable. So we've got a primary budget surplus. Give the minister credit for that. And there is his deficit and debt trajectory. I'm concerned about the debt trajectory. And again, the threats here is that the economic growth is not going to materialize. That's part of the threat to this budget. Next one, please. This, by the way, includes Eskom debt as well. The Minister of Finance is taking over. Next one. Skip that one. We've had a look at that one again. This is just a deficit on a graph. Next one, please. And again, I'll give you the slide again. The minister is a major dis-saver, which simply means they borrow long-term money to spend on short-term current expenditure. And that means that the minister destroys the equivalent of about 2% of GDP in terms of dis-saving, destroying capital every year. Next slide, please. That's part of the reason why we don't have enough. Next one, please. That's part of the reason why we don't have enough savings in South Africa, because the minister is a destroyer of capital. Okay, debt relief for Eskom over the next 3 years. It's capital as well as interest, and that will increase the debt to GDP ratio by about 3% relative to GDP. I did mention what I think which should have happened to Eskom earlier. Next one, please. That was quite an interesting one, and I want to repeat, we are actually privatizing Eskom. That is happening. I think chances are quite good we're going to get the grey listed. The minister actually indicated that he's pretty sure that is going to happen. And he did put some money aside. So if we grey listed, hopefully the money will be well used to fix some of those loopholes so that we move back to the white list soon again. Next slide, please. So it's probably going to weigh on the exchange rate of the rand a little bit. And being grey listed also creates the possibility of further downgrades. Some final stuff, okay, I think I've mentioned. Go to the next one, please. I just want to show, and the next one as well. Next, please. Next slide. Yeah. And next one, please, Jackie. And the next one, please, Jackie. I'm concerned about public violence, I must tell you. And next and last one, please. I think that's the exchange rate of the rand one. That's it. Yes, the rand currently at 18 whatever, 18 odd. Based on my calculations, I think the rand is overdone. I think the rand can come back a little bit, but obviously there are reasons why the rand is currently on the weak side. Can you just go to the final one, or the next one, please, Jackie? And there is the QR code again. Take your phone, take a picture of that, and you can get this presentation. So there you have it, Jackie. I don't know how it works with questions, if there are any questions. And I'm very sorry again, my apologies. Technology is not my strong point, but there you have it. There's the presentation. I think my email address will always also be available. If there are any questions, please send that to me and I will try to answer that. Jackie.
Thanks, Dawie. I was just scrolling through to have a look for any questions to pose to you. You did address the grey listing. I think it worries a lot of us. So yeah, heard the comment about expect that the grey listing could happen. What's the implication for us?
Yeah, the implications will be, I don't think it will have a massive impact on the economy, but what it will do, and I know from experience because I'm in the financial industry, is that there's going to be much more red tape. There's going to be more loops that you have to jump through if you want to do business internationally. As it is already, you have to share your blood type with a financial institution internationally before they prepare to open an account. So the sectors that will be affected directly will be mostly the financial industry. I think banks and asset managers and stockbrokers, those kind of guys. But indirectly, of course, trade will be affected as well. Two broad categories will be affected. The one has to do with trade and trade finance internationally, and the second one has to do with capital flows internationally. Those two things will be affected. And of course, there will be an impact on the economy. But what I'm a little bit concerned about as well, if you look at previous countries that got grey listed, usually what happens, they also got downgraded as well. So there's a possible, depending what happened to our fiscal matrix, but with a grey list, chances for a downgrade. But I must say, I'm not too concerned about this. If we really are serious about fixing all those loopholes, we can get back to the whitelist fairly soon, within the next couple of months, in fact, if we're really serious.